today's. Now that we've got the recording underway, we can kind of make some progress. So thanks for joining us again today for session 3 of our records management and sensitive data workshop. I'm Rick Wilson. So if you've been on a couple of the previous sessions, you already know a little bit about me. If this is the first opportunity you've had to join us for this series, don't worry. If you want to see the prior versions of the prior sessions, we've got those recorded. There'll be a link at the end to point you towards those recordings. But I'm a product manager at Gimmal. I work with Gimmal Discover primarily, which is our information governance product. And we spent a lot of time talking about that in last week's session. I'm also joined today by Christina Hill behind the scenes from our marketing team. And Christina will be monitoring the chat if you have any kind of technical issues during the course of the presentation, or maybe a question that you want to tee up that we can discuss at the end. Feel free to do that, and Christina will keep an eye on things for us. So thanks for backing me up today, Christina. Appreciate that. So again, if you joined us for previous sessions, you know a bit about Gimmal already. For those of you who may be new, just a quick introduction. Gimmal specializes in developing software for information governance, and we really have an end-to-end approach that allows our clients to be able to do that. From a full records management suite that covers both electronic and physical records to help you manage and control that information through its life cycle, and then dispose of it in the appropriate manner at the end of its life cycle. We've got Gimmal Discover, which of course is our information governance product. We'll talk a lot about how that can be useful to you today as you begin to plan or maybe think about implementing an information governance strategy in your organization. Gimmal Migrate helps our customers move content into SharePoint Online from various sources, whether it be a legacy document management environment like Content Server, or maybe just off of their file shares if you're trying to get into SharePoint Online as part of your Microsoft 365 subscription. We can help you get content into that world and be able to manage it moving forward. And then Gimmal Link is for our SAP customers who are moving again to perhaps SharePoint Online, and they've got a lot of content in SAP that they need to preserve the linkages to if they move it out of SAP and into SharePoint. And Gimmal Link can certainly help you do that. So it's a little bit about Gimmal and our suite of products. We can help you from beginning to end with information governance. But the focus of this series has been exactly that topic. Maybe help you get started with an information governance initiative, maybe move forward if you're already in an entry-level state from an information governance point of view. In session 1, a couple of weeks ago, we started with a why. And primarily during that session, we were discussing 2 things, and that was the risks that are associated with not managing your electronic content. And there's a huge amount of those. If you saw that session or if you've been paying attention, there are data breaches being announced almost every week. And sometimes those are substantial data breaches. So you really need to put in place some kind of a policy or program or strategy to help you manage that electronic content in the event of a breach, or perhaps maybe avoid a breach by doing so. And then we moved on last week to how you might be able to do some of those things to mitigate perhaps some of that threat risk or address some of those compliance mandate issues. And we did that largely by taking you through how Gimmal Discover works and showing you how the tool could be used to maybe identify redundant or obsolete information, maybe help you wrap your arms around what in your environment might be sensitive content, and taking some steps to identify and remediate that. And that brings us to today's session, which we called results. And this is really my favorite topic. We're going to discuss at length the way some of our live customers are using our products today to manage their content and some of the results that they've received. So I think it's really interesting to see how your peers might be managing information. Perhaps it'll give you some ideas about programs that you can implement in your organization, or maybe it will help you get started on the road to an information governance journey. So largely, the case studies that we're going to look at fall into one of these four areas, and we'll kind of wade down through these a little bit. And that begins with being able to manage content at the folder level on devices. Now, device is a pretty generic term. In this context, we're looking at devices as perhaps a user workstation. It could be maybe a network file share. In some cases, it could be your mailbox environment. So there's kind of a broad usage. And we're going to talk about a couple of different topics through the case study section that touch on those different areas and how a governance strategy has been really useful to some of our clients. Moving down to the next bullet on number 2, then we're focusing here very more precisely on workstations. And this is an area that's often overlooked by clients that we deal with. There is an extraordinary amount of information that people are keeping on their desktops. Even if you've moved to a cloud storage paradigm like OneDrive or maybe Box or Dropbox, there's still the possibility, unless you've completely locked it down, which is possible, but it's not as typical from our experience. There's a possibility that your users are storing information on those local machines. It's become even more of a problem with the work from home environment since the pandemic. So many of us are back in the office or perhaps back in the office periodically. And that's good news in some cases, but that doesn't mean that people still aren't keeping information on their local machines for those days that they work at home and so forth. So being able to identify that, maybe interrogate it to see what kind of information is being kept. Perhaps you need to be able to do that in the event of an e-discovery search. We're going to talk about some ways that's being used by clients in our world today. Applying retention rules to your content. So those of you that come from a records background, of course, are probably extremely sensitive to the fact that each piece of information that's being kept needs to be tracked. It needs to have a life cycle. It needs to have a disposition at some point. That's great for records content, but there's a lot of information that's falling outside of the records environment. And when I'm talking about in specifics, we run into it in the mailbox environment, especially today. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you may need to put some kind of policy in force to manage content in your email environment. You know, our mail vendors have done a great service to us, I guess, by allowing us to have these large sort of unlimited mailboxes. I'm not entirely convinced as an old timer that anybody needs a 4 gig mailbox, but that bias aside, the ability for customers or employees or users to be able to store an extraordinary amount of information in their mailbox environment can turn into a problem for you, not only from the standpoint of litigation, from the standpoint of providing sensitive data or hiding information that you think may have been already disposed of properly that's contained in a mailbox folder someplace, but also, even though they're not as popular today, the ability to store information outside of the mailbox environment in a PST file. So some of our clients, in fact, have very large PST stores, even though they may not allow information to be stored PSTs currently. Maybe they block that through group policy or some other mechanism. Very often there's a historical set of PSTs that are still lingering in the environment, and very often on your user workstations. And then finally, we already talked a little bit about number 4, this ability to be able to manage the PST content, maybe even inventory. Let's find out who has them. Part of the situation that we've seen in the past is, in some cases, the employees don't even realize they have PSTs. You know, Outlook has popped up that helpful little dialog box for them at some point that says, would you like to archive old information, and created a series of PSTs on their hard drive. And they may not even be aware of the fact that that has happened or that information being stored. So let's make sure we consider that as part of our email implementation strategy as well. So let's get into the meat of the content today. All of these case studies that we're going to talk about are live clients that we've worked with in the past for very specific situations. In many cases, they're using our tools for some kind of another purpose, but a specific business case has popped up and they've been able to adapt the use of a piece of Gimmal software to help them identify information and address a challenge that they've run into. And that's kind of the case with this particular client. So their industry is healthcare. This was a healthcare provider on the West Coast. And they were on the forefront of COVID-19 when COVID started to pop up in the United States. And they had a large number of cases early on. There was an extensive amount of information being passed around largely through email by members of the healthcare organization relative to COVID and how it was being handled in the environment and so forth. But the byproduct of that was, as time went on, that litigation started to occur. And there were a number of cases that involved, perhaps an accusation of malpractice or misfeasance on the standpoint of providing health care to a particular individual. Nevertheless, they were in a position, the provider was in a position where they had to quickly be able to respond to these e-discovery requests. And in their case, this was sort of a deluge of cases. They had many that popped up over a very short period of time. They didn't have, as many of you perhaps, they didn't have a dedicated litigation response team. In this particular situation, a lot of the work fell to the existing IT team. So those gentlemen were faced with the situation where they had to basically put their day-to-day work on hold and manage their focus to get to finding this information in fulfillment of these electronic discovery cases. So we were able to help them out with our Gimmal Discover product by implementing the e-discovery component. E-discovery allowed them to build a search and electronically point that search at a variety of repositories. In their situation, a lot of the content was in email, so it was either a mailbox sort of an interrogation or perhaps a PST. Both of those were at play in this particular case. And by giving them a focal point, a central area where they could go in and build these requests with a very flexible set of search terms to adapt to whatever the requirements were for each one of those requests, they were able to rapidly implement the searches, generate a result set, handle that result set back to the legal team, in this case, largely an outside litigation firm that was helping them through these difficult situations. And the litigation firm then was able to take the responsive information and push forward from a results point of view. So it saved them a lot of time and effort in the long run from the standpoint of being able to respond to these e-discovery requests. Client confidential information for many of you may be an issue. You may have agreements or contracts or understandings with your client that as you're working with them on a project or during the course of an engagement, that you're going to protect that information and keep it safe. That, of course, begs the question, what happens to that information when the engagement ends? And that's what this use case was all about. So we were addressing a business challenge where the client had a previous tool in place that was helping them manage electronic information on their user devices, their workstations, but that tool didn't work with Microsoft 365. So when they moved their email environment to 365, they had to very quickly find a replacement product that would allow them to do that. And this turned out to be a really interesting use case because they used Gimmal software to help them in two phases of the operation. So the initial phase was what they call onboarding. As an employee was assigned to a client engagement, they used the Gimmal tool to be able to create repositories where employees could store information that was relative to that engagement. Some of those were in the mailbox, folders in the mailbox environment. Some of them were on the local machine because the employees very often were working on site at a client, so they were storing information locally. So using Gimmal's products, they were able to create designated storage locations where engagement-specific content was supposed to be stored. Then the converse of that, on the flip side of the equation, there was an offboarding process. And during offboarding, as an employee wrapped up with an engagement, their engagement manager could have those repositories scanned to see if any information was still present. So is there client confidential information that was generated during the course of the engagement in your designated mailbox folders or perhaps on your local hard drive? So that process would be automatically performed, the scanning. A report is generated to the employee that says this was the information for the engagement that we located, engagement XYZ. They are also, as part of that communication, which happens electronically via email, provided with a link where they can examine those items. So this file was located, this message was located in this folder in your mailbox, and so forth. And then they can mark disposition on those content items. So these files can be deleted, these email messages can be removed. This content needs to be stored in a archive folder because the client may need us to come back and revisit it, or it may be appropriate to another engagement or what have you. But the point is, by automating that process, we were able to help this client start to wrap their arms around maybe an end-to-end process with managing their client confidential information. And this is a medium-sized enterprise client. So we were managing content for 30,000-ish workstations. So fairly large engagement, certainly more than a normal organization will be able to do manually. Complying with legal mandates. So this was kind of an interesting situation as well. This was a higher education client, a university, and they were using Gimmal's products for other use cases to help them with e-discovery, to help them with some data governance, to manage Sarbanes-Oxley and some other kinds of compliance issues that they had. But they realized after they became embroiled in this legal challenge that it could be used in a lot of other contexts. So in this particular situation, they were hit with a cease and desist order from a provider of a video file. And the presence of that video file on their network was a real problem. And they had to guarantee that that file had been located and removed from their network. And as you can imagine with a university, there's a large number of potential endpoints or file shares, perhaps, where that information might be stored. So they were able to adapt the Gimmal product that they already had in place to help them address this situation. And there's a number of ways that you can do this to search for a specific file. You could do it through the name of the file itself, of course, which is probably the most direct. But you could also generate a hash value for that file and be able to look for the hash value in case somebody has maybe taken the file and renamed it and placed it in another folder. But the point is, by doing that electronically and pointing it at, say, a network file share or a series of user workstations, this client was able to rapidly provide a list of all the areas where that video might be present so that they could guarantee that those were removed. Now, they had the option of removing them automatically with the product that they were using. I don't believe they chose to do that. They sent notices to the custodians who had that information, the users who actually had it in their network file shares, and asked them to remove it. But the net is they were able to guarantee that those files had been removed. And they were able to continue that scan process to make sure that they weren't reapplied. So once the scan was created with a specific set of criteria to identify this copyrighted video, they were able to run that periodically to make sure that it didn't pop up in their network environment. So oftentimes, this is kind of a day-to-day struggle for IT departments inside our organization, and that is managing content that might be phishing or some other hazard-based information that's showing up in employees, specifically mailboxes is where we see this most often. In this particular situation, this happened to be a biotech firm, so they were a pharmaceutical organization. And they were using Gimmal products to manage their email content from a retention point of view. But they had a situation occur where an employee realized too late that they had responded to a phishing message, and that message had captured information from their device and was starting to spread it to other users in that employee's contact list through the email system. That information in that email was, of course, phishing related. It had some potentially hazardous attachment content that was associated with it. And they wanted to, as rapidly as possible, remove any incidents of that message from their user mailboxes. Pretty big challenge. If you don't have software in place to do this already, and you have several thousand mailboxes, you're certainly not going to be able to open each one of those in Outlook and scan them in a time-efficient manner to determine if this message is resident in the mailbox. And that's exactly what we were able to help them do electronically. So we created a rule set. If you were on the last video, I talked a little bit about how our Gimmal Discover product has workflows that can be tailored to specific use case situations. And that's the situation we used in this response to be able to build a workflow that looked for criteria matching the message. In their particular case, that message had a specific subject line, and then it also had a specifically named attachment that was present in the body of the email message itself. So we keyed in on those two pieces of content and then automatically deleted that from the user mailbox environment. So in a matter of a few hours, in this case, it says 1 hour, but I think it took us a while to generate the rule and get it run. But the rule took about an hour to run across their mailbox environment. Several thousand of their mailboxes were purged or cleaned up that might have been contaminated by this phishing email. So from their point of view, this was a big win. So this was a situation that could have detoured their IT team for a number of days dealing with this, not only from an identification and instruction standpoint, but also from the standpoint of addressing anybody who actually inadvertently clicked on the phishing message and propagated the problem. So a great success story for their situation. And then our final use case to talk about today is one revolving around sensitive data identification. This is something that many of you have to deal with. And we talked a little bit about this in some of the earlier sessions. This term sensitive data is so misleading because it means different things to different kinds of organizations. And in this example, this was an insurance provider, an insurance use case. They had a number of, again, employee mailboxes that they had to be able to guarantee didn't have specific types of information. So from their point of view, that term sensitive data revolved around Social Security numbers that were tagged to constituents' information relevant to claims and other things that they might be tracking. But they also had PHI, which is patient health information, that was resident in those mailbox environments. And they stumbled on this quite accidentally and realized that they did potentially have a problem and they needed to put a procedure in place to be able to help them identify this moving forward and take action against this information. Now, the interesting thing about PHI is there are a huge amount of codes that might be relevant to patient health information. We probably think about things like the Social Security number that you might see on an insurance claim form, but every communication with a provider, a physician or clinic and what have you, typically had some kind of diagnosis-related information through an ICD-10 code. And those are the standardized codes the medical industry uses to identify what the procedure was and how they addressed it. So there were thousands. You can see in the text here over 72,000 of these that had to be examined as they walked through the mailbox environment. So it's not easy to be able to do that from a manual point of view, certainly. You need some kind of technology to help you power through that. And they were able to use Gimmal Discover to build those searches and apply them to their mailbox environment. That was especially helpful for them because it helped them avoid some penalties for having this information in their environment. And it allowed them to guarantee that it didn't happen again. So these scans once they addressed the initial problem, as in some of our other use cases, this became a recurring business process for them. So they were able to run these scans on a continual basis. One of the things I failed to mention, we talked about one of the earlier use cases, my university health or higher education use case. Their ability to guarantee that they were scanning their environment for potentially hazardous information. If you'll recall, in their case, it was a copyrighted video, but there were also other compliance type email pieces of data that they had in their environment from student enrollment and things like that. But the fact that they had a tool that allowed them to be able to do that and be able to take action on that content helped them be able to negotiate a discount on their cyber insurance. So something to think about. You know, one of the goals of this series was to provide your Army with information that would not only give you some ideas about how you could approach managing content and sensitive data in your environment, but also maybe help you champion that with your organization and get some support from leadership about taking some of these steps, making the investment to manage content. And you can go so far with the fear factor, you know, the idea that, hey, we are potentially opening ourselves up to a data breach, or we may be out of compliance. But there's also this other aspect that from an insurance standpoint, from a litigation standpoint, being able to prove that you've got products or processes in place to manage and identify this sensitive data can help you from an organization point of view save some money by lowering the premium on your cyber insurance, or perhaps helping you obtain cyber insurance. In some cases, it's difficult to obtain those policies without some kind of technology in place to guarantee the results. So that's the content that we had in place for you today. I know I covered a lot of information and we covered it in a fairly compact time frame, but we did want to give you some real world examples of how people are using Gimmal software today and maybe point you in the right direction for some of your efforts. So, you know, from my point of view, I hope that one of the things we've discussed over these three editions of the Sensitive Data webinar series were helpful to you. Certainly worth your time. We appreciate all your attendance. If there was any questions in the Q&A, Christina, happy to take those now.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chris asked, does Discover require credentials to log into all target devices before extracting content?
Yeah, really great question. So Chris, we do require credentials for managed systems. And what I mean by managed systems are things like your Microsoft Mailbox environment, OneDrive, SharePoint. From the standpoint of a user workstation, we use a built-in account that's on the workstation. It's called local system. So when you push those Gimmal Discover components out to your local workstation environment, you can install them as local system, which is a built-in account in Windows that's always present, and they would have the permissions they need to be able to scan that device. Good question.
Right, that seems to be all the questions that I'm seeing on my side. Please feel free, if you've got any other ones, to drop in the chat or the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Christina. So I mentioned at the beginning of the session, if you did miss a previous version and you'd like to go back and look at either the first or second editions of the series, those are going to be posted on YouTube. I'm sure, Christina, we're going to get this one up as well at some point. So there'll be all three videos available to look at. And just a reminder, as we've done in previous sessions, there's going to be Gimmals out there in the world that are going to be attending some events. So Christina, if you have any color commentary you wanted to add this, but
yeah, if you've joined us along our series, no news here really, except we will be hosting an event on night 1 of InfoGov World at the quintessential Top Gun bar. So if you are in the area and just want to come to dinner, or if you do plan on attending the show, please use our promo code GML50 for 50% off registration. That'll go a long way. And if anything, please let me know that you'll be in the area, and I'd love to send you an email about the details for the dinner.
All right, thanks, Christina. Appreciate it so much. Thank you again, everybody, for attending the session. We appreciate your support and your interest, and we look forward to speaking to you on the next one. Bye now.